You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, you and I have spoken extensively about the prospect of an impending constitutional crisis in the sense that a court order is handed down and Trump opts to ignore it. We are there right now. Can you explain what just happened today?
Yeah, we are there, Brian. We may not be exactly in constitutional crisis territory, but we do have the Trump administration outright defying an order that was issued by the chief judge for the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C., Judge Boasberg. And here's what happened. There was a suit filed because apparently it was known that the U.S. government, Donald Trump, through Marco Rubio's actions, was going to try to deport hundreds of Venezuelans to El Salvador. Apparently, there is an agreement that's been reached, according to the reporting, between Marco Rubio, the executive branch of the U.S. government, and the government of El Salvador to take, whoever we choose to collect up and try to deport to El Salvador. And what the reporting has revealed is that there were more than 200 Venezuelans who our federal government, our executive branch, just summarily says, well, they're gang members, therefore we're going to grab them up and we're going to send them to El Salvador. Let me just pause here for a minute. I wouldn't even call that a deportation. There are actually laws and rules and procedures that go along with actually deporting people who are here illegally, who have been deemed by a court to be here illegally. This really, to me, feels more like a kidnapping and an ejection from the United States of America, but it's being called a deportation. So what happened was, federal agents went and collected up more than 200 Venezuelans that they claimed were dangerous gang members, and they put them on a plane and they sent them to El Salvador, where they were received and, according to the reporting, put into terrorism confinement centers where they can just arbitrarily be held for a year. But of course, the reporting is they can re-up that for additional years if the El Salvadoran authorities decide to do that. So while this was ongoing, the judge from D.C. federal court, the chief judge, ordered the Trump administration essentially not to do it. Now, it looks like the planes may have already been in the air at that point. The devil's in the details. We need more reporting on that. But the judge said if the planes are in the air, then turn them around and send them back because you don't have a lawful basis to do it. In essence, he issued a temporary restraining order, a TRO, telling them you can't do it because there will be irreparable harm that I can't undo with, the court system or with court orders. And as best we can tell, the Trump administration either ignored or intentionally defied the order to turn the planes around and bring those Venezuelans back to the U.S. so there could be some sort of a lawful process applied before they were deported. So the question now is teed up. Does that constitute a constitutional crisis? Because it feels like there's been an intentional disobedience to a lawful court order. That takes some unpacking, Brian, because, first of all, we don't know, for example, the exact details about whether those planes could have turned around mid-flight, whether they would have had enough fuel to make it back, if in fact they were in the air when this court order was issued. I do think that we are incrementally, not just sort of moving slowly in the direction of a constitutional crisis, but basically the Trump administration seems to be sprinting in the direction of a constitutional crisis. And then we can kind of talk about what the next steps might be and whether this will ripen into sort of a full-blown, gloves-off, true constitutional crisis.
Well, to that point, then, there are those who say, well, it's not yet a constitutional crisis because this is a trial court and we have to wait until the Supreme Court hands down a ruling that the Trump administration opts to defy. What's your reaction to that?
My reaction is it really depends on how you choose to define constitutional crisis. I would say the most accurate definition is when two branches of government have reached the absolute top of their authority. Now, what does that mean? It means a presidential directive that is being carried out by the executive branch and a Supreme Court ruling that says to the executive branch, you can't do what you are proposing to do. That, I think, is the most accurate definition of a true constitutional crisis, because if Donald Trump and his administration, the executive branch, says, we don't care what the Supreme Court says, even though under our constitutional construct, the Supreme Court is the last authority on what is or is not constitutional and lawful for the executive branch to do. If the executive branch defies a Supreme Court ruling, there is no higher court of appeal, there's no higher authority, and there's nobody to sort of break that deadlock. There's no lawful referee. That is when the country is plunged into true constitutional crisis territory. And if the executive branch defies the Supreme Court ruling and the Supreme Court authority, then, at least in that moment, Brian, democracy and the checks and balances that are built into our Constitution, our national charter, it's all at an end. And then, frankly, it feels like it's every man for himself. So I do think some people could say, listen, he's already violated a direct court order from a lower court, a trial court. Yes, he has. But I think incrementally, the next thing we might see is, one, an evidentiary hearing to see whether, for example, the planes were capable of being turned around midair, if that's when the court order hit, and then two, probably a follow-up court order saying, okay, if they weren't able to turn around, I am ordering you to return these Venezuelans who weren't deported in a lawful way, who were kidnapped and ejected from the United States in violation of any sense of due process rights. And if that gets violated, then we're going to see it working its way up to the Supreme Court. So it feels like we are in constitutional crisis territory, but I think there are a few more incremental steps before we truly get there.
Well, look, yes, I understand what you're saying about getting all the way up to the Supreme Court, but in the interim, it's not like the judge here, the federal judge in the trial court, is just going to say, oh, well, it's all well and good, because really the final arbiter, the only people who matter here are what the Supreme Court justices say. And so what happens right now with Judge Boasberg? Because I wouldn't presume that a judge is just going to take lying down the fact that the federal government is blatantly ignoring a lawful order.
Yeah, Brian, perhaps my favorite question of this discussion, because then we see the C word conjured up, contempt. Because even if you're not in an ultimate constitutional crisis where two branches of government have run things all the way up the chain to the highest level, we are in contempt territory. So that takes us off in another direction. If Judge Boasberg holds a hearing and he determines that the Trump administration intentionally defied a court order, then the next thing I would expect is for him to issue what's called a show cause order directing the Trump administration and its high officials to show why they should not be held in contempt. And, if we make our way through the different contempt options, there's civil contempt, which basically is a way to leverage fines and penalties to try to coerce a branch of government or executive branch officials to comply with court orders. But ultimately, it can go to criminal contempt when the court can order that Trump administration officials be jailed. And they can only, they virtually will hold the keys to the jail cell in their own hands. They have to purge the contempt, and they have to begin complying with court orders in order to be released from a period of confinement. All of this is sort of the most extreme end game, but I'll tell you, it feels like Donald Trump and his administration is determined to push a co-equal branch of government, the judiciary, to that end game.
And finally, Glenn, let's end with this. I know that there are going to be those on the right who say, why stick your neck out at all for folks who we're talking about Venezuelan gang members, alleged Venezuelan gang members. And so why not want to just get them out of the country as soon as possible? Why go through this whole process of trying to prevent them from being just deported as quickly as humanly possible? And so what would you say to that argument?
I would say first, Brian, these are alleged Venezuelan gang members. What we don't allow our executive branch to do, our prosecutors, our law enforcement agencies, is to say, with no hearing, no evidentiary showing, and no due process, these 200 people, in my estimation, are bad folk. I'm going to call them Venezuelan gang members. Grab them up without due process, without any rights, without any hearings, put them on a dang plane and send them to another country. That'll teach them. Listen, I am not arguing in favor of allowing dangerous, folks who are members of gangs and who are here illegally to run around our country with impunity. I would never argue that. Hell, I was a career prosecutor and I went after people who broke the laws of the United States. However, if you have no due process, you have Donald Trump sitting up on high, and by basically royal fiat, he says, gone with all of these people, then we're not protecting anybody, because there has to be a lawful process in place before the United States gets to grab people up and eject them from our country.
Glenn, in terms of the collateral damage here, could we be looking at a situation where we can see folks who are not Venezuelan gang members get caught up in this, either because they were wrongly accused of being a gang member, or even worse, that there's no way that they were gang members. That was just used as the justification, as the predicate to be able to round them up and deport them as easily as possible.
Yeah, Brian, give the Trump administration an unconstitutional inch and they're going to take an unconstitutional mile. So today it is summarily declaring hundreds of people dangerous gang members with no evidentiary showing, no court hearing, no due process, and no judicial ruling. And what's next? Oh, well, what about the folks that I say are dangerous Mexican gang members? What about the folks who are here from Canada and we find some pretext to say we want to eject them from our country? I don't want to say if you come for the least among us, you're ultimately going to work your way up. It's not really about the least among us. It's about process. It's about rights. It's about the Constitution, and it's about, a process by which judges and courts can weigh in after an evidentiary hearing and say, you know what? Yes, these are people who are here illegally and they're dangerous, and our law and our Constitution provides and demands that they be deported. That's the way we do it in America, not by royal pronouncement.
Right, and by the way, that would really redound to Trump's benefit if you have a legitimate justification to deport these folks because they are Venezuelan gang members, then make the case. And there's not going to be anybody who's vying for these people to stay. And so if you have a legitimate basis for them to be deported, then just make that case.
Yeah, but Donald Trump, it's all about a power grab, and it's about fear and intimidation and the deterrent effect he believes his fear, his threats, his intimidation will have on chilling others who might want to come to this country, even perhaps legally to, live out the American dream. So, this is about a power grab. It's not about legitimate law enforcement to make sure we're applying the laws in the Constitution and honoring the due process rights of people, and thereby protecting the United States of America.
Well, we will stay on top of this. Obviously, this has the potential. I mean, we're already very close to being there, but this has the potential to bubble up into something quite significant here. So we'll stay on top of this case. For everybody who's watching right now, if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe to both of our channels. That's the best way to support our work and independent media more broadly. I'll put the links right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.